Keanu Reeves stepped into the bustling toy store, blending into the holiday crowd with his usual quiet presence. Shelves overflowed with gifts, parents hurried through the aisles, and the sound of Christmas music filled the air. It was supposed to be a place of joy. But then he heard it. A sharp, condescending voice cut through the festive noise. "If you can't afford it, don't waste my time," the store manager sneered. Keanu turned his head. Near the toy shelves, a man stood frozen, gripping a small train set in his hands. His clothes were worn, his shoulders tense with humiliation. He had been counting his money, trying to buy a gift for his son, until he was treated like he didn't belong. Most people looked away, but not Keanu Reeves. What he did next would leave the entire store speechless and prove that kindness can change everything. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow we have another inspiring story just for you. The toy store was bustling with holiday shoppers. The soft jingle of Christmas music played through the speakers, blending with the hum of conversations and the excited squeals of children running between aisles. Shelves were stacked with plush toys, action figures, dolls, and intricate train sets. The air smelled of plastic, wrapping paper, and the artificial pine scent from the massive Christmas tree near the entrance. Amidst the cheerful chaos, a man stood hesitantly by one of the shelves, carefully studying the price tags. His name was Alex. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slightly hunched, his winter jacket frayed at the edges. His fingers fumbled with a few crumpled bills in his pocket as his eyes settled on a toy train set, bright red, with a miniature locomotive and tiny tracks that circled around a small station. He could already see the joy on his 6-year-old son's face, the way his eyes would light up at the sight of it. Alex glanced at the price again. It was just a little over what he had, and he bit his lip, debating. He could get it, but then the grocery money for the next few days would be tight. Maybe there was a smaller set somewhere? He looked around, trying to find a cheaper option, but the store was packed, and the crowd made it difficult to navigate. "Sir, are you planning to stand there all day?" A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Alex turned, startled, facing a man in a neatly pressed suit with a name tag pinned to his chest. "Manager" was written in bold letters below his name, though Alex didn't have time to read it. The man crossed his arms, tapping his foot impatiently. "If you're not buying, don't block the aisle," he said, voice loud enough for several customers nearby to glance over. Alex swallowed hard, feeling heat rise to his face. The manager let out an exaggerated sigh. "Just what? Wasting time?" He eyed Alex's worn-out clothes, his tired expression, the way he hesitated before answering. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Look, if you can't afford it, don't linger. This isn't a charity." A mother browsing nearby quickly pulled her child away, as if not wanting to be associated with the scene. A couple at the end of the aisle exchanged an awkward glance before pretending to be deeply invested in the selection of board games. No one spoke up, no one intervened. Alex's fingers tightened around the bills in his pocket. His stomach churned with humiliation. He wasn't a beggar, he wasn't loitering, he just needed a moment to decide. But the way the manager looked at him, the way people averted their eyes, made him feel small. "I was just about to buy it," Alex said, trying to keep his voice steady. He reached for the train set, gripping the box as if that alone would prove his worth, but the manager only scoffed. "Sure you were." His tone was dripping with sarcasm. "Well, hurry it up. We have real customers to attend to." Alex clenched his jaw, willing himself to ignore the growing lump in his throat. He turned toward the registers, ready to buy the train and leave this place as quickly as possible, even if it meant struggling for the rest of the week. But before he could take a step, another voice rang out. Calm, firm, unmistakable. "Is there a problem here?" The tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. a quiet authority that made the air in the store shift slightly. The manager stiffened, his smug expression faltering as he turned toward the speaker. The other customers, who had been so quick to look away moments ago, now seemed unable to tear their gazes from the scene. Standing just a few feet away, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, was Keanu Reeves. Alex had not always struggled like this. There was a time when life had been different, when he and his wife Emily had been able to provide for their son, Tom, without worrying about every last dollar. He used to work as a mechanic at a decent repair shop, earning enough to get by. They weren't rich, but they had a small apartment, warm meals every night, and the comfort of knowing that as long as they worked hard, things would be okay. But then Emily got sick. It started as something minor, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. By the time they realized it was serious, the hospital bills had already begun piling up. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Alex worked extra shifts, took on side jobs fixing cars out of their cramped garage, did anything he could to keep up with the mounting expenses. But it was never enough. Tom had been too young to understand what was happening, too young to fully grasp why his mother, once full of life, had grown so weak. The day she passed, Alex felt like the world had collapsed around him. But there was no time to grieve. He had to keep going. For Tom. He sold whatever he could, downsized their apartment, and tried to stretch every penny. His old job let him go when he started missing shifts to take care of his son, and from then on, everything was a constant struggle. Finding steady work proved harder than he expected. He picked up whatever he could, night shifts at a warehouse, occasional handyman jobs, anything that paid enough to keep food on the table. But the bills never stopped. Rent, electricity, school supplies, food. It all drained away what little he made, leaving just enough to survive, but never enough to feel secure. Despite everything, Alex did his best to make Tom's life feel normal. He made sure his son never felt the weight of their struggles. He smiled through his exhaustion, helped with homework even when he could barely keep his eyes open, and found small ways to bring joy into their tiny apartment. Tom, just 6 years old, was too young to understand the depth of his father's sacrifices, but he knew one thing for sure. His dad loved him. Then, a few weeks ago, Tom had pointed at the toy train set in a store window. "Dad, look, it's just like the one in the Christmas movies." His eyes had been wide with excitement, his little fingers pressed against the glass. "Do you think Santa could bring me one?" Alex had smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Maybe, buddy, we'll see." That night, after Tom had fallen asleep, Alex had checked the price of the train online. It wasn't the most expensive toy, but for him, it was a luxury he couldn't justify. He had convinced himself it wasn't a big deal. Tom had other toys, even if they were mostly hand-me-downs from neighbors or secondhand finds. But every night after that, Tom had asked about the train. Not in a demanding way, but with the hopeful innocence only a child could have. And so, Alex had decided he would find a way. He cut back on his own meals, took on an extra shift at the warehouse, even walked instead of taking the bus to save a few dollars. It wasn't much, but little by little he managed to put together just enough to buy the train. That was why he had been in the store, hesitating in front of the shelf, counting and recounting his money to make sure he had enough. And that was when the manager had humiliated him in front of everyone, treating him like he didn't belong, like he was wasting space. Now, standing frozen in the aisle, Alex barely processed what was happening as the tall man in the dark jacket stepped forward. The murmurs in the store grew quieter. There was something about him, something familiar. But Alex wasn't focused on that. His heart was still pounding from the embarrassment of the moment before. Keanu Reeves, however, had seen enough. His sharp eyes had taken in everything. The way the manager had sneered, the way the other shoppers had turned away, the way Alex had shrunk under the weight of humiliation. He had seen moments like this before, had even lived them once upon a time, and he wasn't about to let it slide. The store fell into an uneasy silence as Keanu Reeves stepped forward, his gaze steady and unreadable. The manager, still puffed up with self-importance, took a moment to register who had spoken. When he did, his expression shifted, first to confusion, then to something closer to disbelief. He blinked, his mouth opening slightly before snapping shut again, as if his mind was struggling to reconcile the casually dressed man in front of him with the global superstar he recognized from countless films. Keanu didn't give him time to recover. "I asked if there was a problem," he repeated, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. His eyes flicked to Alex, who stood stiffly with the toy train set clutched in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping the box too tightly. Then he looked back at the manager, waiting for an answer. The manager let out a small, incredulous laugh, straightening his posture as if to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Reeves," he said, adopting a tone that was suddenly far more polite than before. "No problem at all. Just making sure everything runs smoothly here. We have a lot of customers today, and we can't afford to have people standing around and—" Keanu held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "That's not what I saw," he said evenly. "What I saw was a man trying to buy a toy for his son while you belittled him in front of everyone." His voice wasn't raised, but there was something in it, something firm, unwavering, that made the air in the store feel heavier. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Keanu and the manager, sensing the tension building. Alex, still rooted in place, felt his stomach twist. He had never asked for this. He didn't want a scene. All he had wanted was to buy his son a simple Christmas present and leave quietly. Now, suddenly, he was the center of attention, with a Hollywood star stepping in to defend him. The weight of it was overwhelming, and a part of him wanted to slip away unnoticed, but another part, a much quieter, more exhausted part, was grateful. Grateful that, for once, someone was standing up for him. The manager forced a tight smile, though the irritation was clear in his eyes. "Look, I was just doing my job," he said. "I have to make sure that our real customers are taken care of first. It's Christmas, Mr. Reeves, and we can't afford to have people wasting time if they're not serious about making a purchase." Keanu's jaw tensed. His eyes darkened, and for a split second, something flickered in them, a memory, perhaps, or a deep understanding that went beyond this moment. He exhaled slowly, then took a step closer. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what exactly makes someone a real customer?" The manager hesitated, thrown off by the question. "Well, I mean—" He gestured vaguely toward Alex. "Look at him. He's been standing there forever, counting his money like he doesn't even know if he can afford it. Meanwhile, we have families in here who don't need to waste time thinking about whether they can buy something. They just do." A hush settled over the store. Someone near the registers gasped quietly. A woman holding a basket of toys frowned, shaking her head. Alex felt his throat tighten. There it was, the confirmation of everything he had felt, everything he had feared. He was an inconvenience, an outsider in a place that was supposed to be for people who didn't have to think twice before making a purchase. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. If anything, his expression grew colder. "So, according to you, the value of a person in this store is determined by how easily they can spend their money?" He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "That's your standard?" The manager opened his mouth, but Keanu didn't let him answer. "I grew up with a mother who worked night shifts just to make sure my sister and I had food on the table," he continued, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I know what it's like to count every dollar before buying something. I know what it's like to hesitate in a store because you're afraid you might not have enough. And I know exactly how it feels when someone like you looks down on you for it." A murmur rippled through the store. Some of the employees behind the counters exchanged glances. A father holding his young daughter's hand shifted his weight, clearly uneasy. Even the manager seemed momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the unexpected personal weight in Keanu's words. Alex, standing to the side, swallowed hard. He had never imagined that a man like Keanu Reeves, someone who had more money than he could ever dream of, would understand what it felt like to be in his position. And yet, the way he spoke, the way his voice carried the weight of experience rather than just sympathy, made it clear that he did. The manager recovered quickly, though. He scoffed, folding his arms. "That's a nice speech, Mr. Reeves," he said. his tone dripping with condescension. "But this is a business. We're not here to make people feel good. We're here to sell. And honestly, I don't see why you care so much. It's not like this guy is your friend." Keanu's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers flexed at his sides, a controlled movement, like someone carefully reining in their temper. He took another step forward, closing the space between them. The manager, despite his bravado, instinctively leaned back. "You don't have to know someone personally to recognize when they're being treated unfairly," Keanu said. "And you don't have to be someone's friend to stand up for them." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut. The manager's smirk faltered for the first time as he realized that Keanu wasn't just some celebrity making a dramatic scene. He was serious, and worse, the crowd was beginning to turn against him. Customers who had previously ignored the exchange were now openly watching, some whispering among themselves, others frowning in disapproval. A woman near the register muttered, "This is disgusting," while an older man shook his head, his grip tightening on the shopping cart handle. Keanu, however, wasn't finished. He kept his gaze locked on the manager, his expression unreadable but firm. "You think this is just about money?" he asked, voice low but carrying across the space. "This isn't about a purchase, it's about dignity. It's about how you treat people, whether they're spending $100 or just trying to buy one toy for their kid." He motioned toward Alex, who still stood frozen in place, the train set held tightly in his hand. "This man walked into your store with the same intention as everyone else here, to buy something for someone he loves, and you decided he wasn't worth your time because he had to think about the cost first?" The manager scoffed, though there was an unmistakable flicker of unease in his eyes. "Look, I don't have time for some morality lecture. If he has the money, he can buy the train. If not, then he should move along so real customers can shop without the holdup." He turned his gaze back to Alex, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a sneer but wasn't far from it either. "Well, you paying or not?" Alex felt his stomach drop. The weight of the moment, the eyes on him, the sheer humiliation of having to stand there while someone decided whether he was worthy of making a simple purchase. It was suffocating. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat felt too tight, and the words wouldn't come. Keanu moved before Alex could even process what was happening. With deliberate, unhurried motions, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and took out a few crisp bills. "He's paying," Keanu said evenly. "And so am I." He walked past the stunned manager and placed the money down at the nearest register. "Ring it up. And add a few more things while you're at it." The cashier, a young man who had been silently observing the scene, hesitated for a second before quickly scanning the toy. The machine beeped and the receipt printed out, in the awkward silence that followed. Keanu picked up the train set and turned to Alex, holding it out. "For your son," he said simply. Alex didn't take it right away. His fingers twitched at his sides, his pride and gratitude warring within him. He had spent years trying to stand on his own, trying to prove that he could take care of his child, no matter how difficult things became. And now here he was, being helped by someone he had never met, someone who owed him nothing, yet had stepped in without hesitation. His vision blurred slightly, and he quickly blinked, exhaling shakily before finally reaching out and accepting the box. His hands trembled slightly as he held it. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to." Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to say anything. Just make sure your kid has a great Christmas." The moment should have ended there, but the manager, still trying to maintain some shred of control, let out a short laugh. "That's cute," he said, though his voice was tighter than before. "Playing hero must feel great. But you're not teaching him anything useful, Mr. Reeves. If people can't afford something, they should just accept it instead of expecting handouts. The world doesn't owe anyone anything." Keanu turned back slowly, his expression unreadable. He studied the man for a long moment, then tilted his head slightly. "You're right," he said at last. "The world doesn't owe anyone anything. But you know what? That doesn't mean we can't be kind. It doesn't mean we can't help someone when we have the chance. And it sure as hell doesn't mean we have to stand by while people like you try to tear others down for no reason." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but a voice interrupted him, one he hadn't been expecting. "I'd like to speak to the owner." The words came from a well-dressed older gentleman who had been browsing the electronics section just moments ago. His tone was polite but firm, and there was a quiet authority to the way he held himself. "Is he here?" The manager blinked, caught off guard. "Well, no, but..." "Good," the man continued. "Then I'll be contacting him myself." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "I'm a regular customer here, and I have no interest in supporting a store that allows this kind of treatment toward people. I imagine quite a few others feel the same way." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. More customers began nodding, some pulling out their own phones, others stepping forward to voice their disapproval. The manager paled slightly, looking around as if realizing, far too late, that the situation had completely turned against him. Keanu didn't say another word. He simply gave Alex a small nod, then turned toward the exit. But before he left, he glanced back one last time at the manager, his expression thoughtful. "I hope you have a good holiday," he said. "And I hope, someday, you understand why this moment mattered more than you think." Then he walked out, the store still buzzing in his wake, leaving behind a stunned silence that the manager could do nothing to fill. The store remained frozen in stunned silence as Keanu walked toward the exit, leaving the manager standing there, his face drained of its earlier smugness. The quiet murmurs among the customers turned into louder whispers and then full conversations. People weren't just watching anymore. They were reacting. Some were shaking their heads. Others were openly criticizing the way Alex had been treated. A woman with a shopping cart turned to her husband and said, "I don't think I want to buy anything from here anymore." Another man near the toy section muttered, "Unbelievable, that guy was just trying to buy a toy for his kid." The cashier, who had rung up the sale, glanced nervously at the manager, then at the older gentleman still scrolling through his phone. The store's atmosphere, which had been warm and festive just minutes ago, now felt tense and charged with something heavier. Alex still stood there, gripping the box in his hands, as if unsure whether he was allowed to move. His heart was pounding, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't out of fear or humiliation. It was something else, a strange mix of relief, gratitude, and something dangerously close to hope. He had spent years convincing himself that the world didn't care about people like him, that he had to fight alone, endure alone. And yet, in the span of just a few minutes, a stranger, no, not just a stranger, one of the most famous men in the world, had stepped in without hesitation, had spoken up for him in a way he never could have done for himself. The manager cleared his throat, desperate to regain control of the situation. He straightened his tie and forced a laugh, though it came out strained. "Well," he said, his voice louder than necessary, "that was quite the performance. But let's be real here, folks. You think that guy actually cares? You'll leave, and you'll forget all about this by tomorrow." A few people turned toward him, their expressions hardening. The older gentleman who had demanded to speak with the owner finally looked up from his phone. "Actually," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I just sent an email to corporate, along with a video." The manager's face twitched. "A video?" "Yes," the man said, lifting his phone slightly. "You didn't notice? A few of us recorded everything, including the way you spoke to this man." He nodded toward Alex. "I imagine that's not the kind of customer service your bosses want representing their brand." A ripple of agreement spread through the store. Several other customers pulled out their phones, showing screens where recording icons still blinked. One woman, holding a shopping basket, added, "Yeah, and I'll be posting it online. Let's see how people feel about spending their money at a place that treats struggling parents like they're beneath them." The manager's face turned red. His eyes darted between the customers, the cashier, and finally Alex, as if looking for someone to back him up. No one did. Even the employees behind the counter, who had remained silent before, looked away, unwilling to defend him. Alex swallowed, his throat dry. He had spent so long being ignored, being invisible, that the sudden attention felt overwhelming. He wanted to say something, to explain that he never meant for any of this to happen. But before he could, the store's overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention customers," a voice announced. "Would the store manager please report to the office immediately?" The color drained from the manager's face. He let out a tight, forced laugh, but it sounded hollow. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," he muttered, but no one was listening anymore. Alex exhaled slowly, gripping the train set tighter. He turned toward the exit, his legs finally allowing him to move. As he stepped outside, the cold winter air hit him, crisp and biting against his skin. He blinked a few times, his breath visible in the night air, his mind still struggling to catch up with everything that had just happened. Keanu was standing a few feet away, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching the snowfall. He didn't turn when Alex approached, but he must have heard him because he spoke first. "You okay?" Alex let out a shaky breath. "I think so," he admitted. "I don't really know what just happened in there." Keanu finally looked over at him, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You stood up for yourself," he said simply. "Even if it didn't feel like it." Alex let out a short laugh, though there was still disbelief in it. "I didn't really do anything." "You didn't have to," Keanu said. "Sometimes other people need to see what's wrong before they find the courage to say something about it. But if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't stood your ground, none of it would have happened." Alex looked down at the toy train in his hands. The same train he had almost convinced himself he couldn't buy. The same train that, just minutes ago, had felt like an impossible luxury. Now, it was his. More importantly, it was his son's. And this time, when his throat tightened, it wasn't out of shame. It was something else entirely. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally, his voice quieter now. Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to. Just take care of your son." Alex nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "I will." Keanu held his gaze for a moment longer before clapping him lightly on the shoulder. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked toward the parking lot, disappearing into the softly falling snow, leaving Alex standing there, holding a Christmas miracle in his hands. Alex stood outside the store for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the edges of the toy train box. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was still racing, replaying everything that had just happened. The humiliation, the anger, the way he had nearly walked out empty-handed, convinced that maybe he didn't deserve something as simple as a Christmas gift for his son. And then, Keanu. The way he had stepped in without hesitation, without waiting for permission. The way he had spoken, not just to the manager, but to everyone, reminding them that dignity wasn't tied to money, that people weren't defined by their bank accounts. He turned, glancing back through the store's glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was still tense. The manager was nowhere to be seen, probably in the back, dealing with the fallout of what had just happened. The customers were still talking, some shaking their heads, others watching the employees, waiting to see how they would respond. The moment hadn't passed, it had planted itself, deep and unmoving, forcing people to reckon with what they had just witnessed. Alex exhaled, finally stepping away from the entrance. He needed to go home. Tom was waiting for him, probably asleep by now, curled up under the too thin blanket in their apartment, dreaming of Christmas morning. Alex had dreaded this night, had feared disappointing his son again, had nearly convinced himself that it was better not to try. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he looked down at the box in his hands and felt something new, something that had been buried under exhaustion and self-doubt for years. Hope. As he walked toward the bus stop, the snow crunching softly beneath his worn-out boots, he thought about what Keanu had said. Just take care of your son. It was simple. So simple. And yet, coming from a man who had everything, who had no reason to care about someone like Alex, it meant more than any grand speech ever could. Because it wasn't pity, it wasn't charity, it was just one person reminding another that they mattered. The bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. Alex climbed aboard, found a seat near the window, and let himself breathe. His reflection in the glass looked different somehow, less tired, less defeated. Maybe nothing had changed, not in the grand scheme of things. His rent was still due, his job was still unstable, the struggles weren't going to disappear overnight. But tonight, Tom would wake up to a gift he had wished for. Tonight, Alex wouldn't have to say, maybe next year. And that was enough. As the bus rumbled through the quiet streets, Alex closed his eyes for just a moment. He had no way of knowing that by tomorrow, the story of what had happened in that store would spread, that videos would go viral, that people all over the world would see what Keanu had done and be reminded of the simple power of kindness. He didn't know that the store would release a statement, that the manager would be quietly replaced, that more people would start questioning how they treated those who walked into their businesses without wealth or status. All he knew was that in a few hours his son would wake up, run to the tiny Christmas tree in the corner of their apartment, and find the one thing he had dreamed of for months. And when he tore off the wrapping paper, when his eyes lit up with pure, unfiltered joy, Alex would be able to look at him and say, "Merry Christmas, buddy." And for the first time in years, he would believe it. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the heater struggling against the winter cold. Alex set the toy train box down carefully on the small table near the Christmas tree, if you could even call it that. It was just a cheap plastic decoration, barely 2 feet tall, something he had picked up at a thrift store years ago. But to Tom, it was magical. Every year, he decorated it with the same worn-out ornaments, placing them with the kind of care only a child could have, believing that, no matter how small or simple it was still Christmas. Alex shrugged off his jacket, rubbing his hands together to warm them up. He glanced at the clock, almost midnight. He was exhausted, but the kind of exhaustion that felt different tonight. Not the crushing weight of defeat, but something lighter. Something close to relief. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Tom as he grabbed a roll of wrapping paper from the shelf. It wasn't much, but he wanted his son to have the joy of unwrapping his gift, of feeling the excitement he deserved to feel on Christmas morning. As he wrapped the toy train, his mind drifted back to the store. He still couldn't quite believe it had happened. How a night that had started with humiliation had ended with something so unexpected. Keanu Reeves. The name alone felt surreal, but what stuck with him more than the name, more than the fame, was the way he had looked at him, not with pity, not with judgment, but with recognition. Like he understood, like he had been there before. Alex finished wrapping the gift, smoothing out the paper before placing it carefully under the tiny tree. He sat back for a moment, just looking at it. It was just a toy. Just a small plastic train set. But it meant everything. It meant that Tom would wake up and feel like every other kid on Christmas morning. It meant that, for once, Alex wouldn't have to see disappointment in his son's eyes. A quiet rustling sound made him turn. Tom stood in the doorway, rubbing his sleepy eyes, his small frame barely visible in the dim light. "Dad?" he mumbled. "You're still awake?" Alex smiled, motioning him over. "Just making sure Santa did his job," he said, nodding toward the tree. Tom's eyes widened when he saw the wrapped box. He hurried over, crouching down beside it, his fingers hovering over the package as if he couldn't believe it was real. "Is this?" he whispered, looking up at his father. Alex nodded. "Go ahead, buddy." Tom tore into the wrapping paper, his hands moving fast, his breath hitching with excitement. When he saw the train set, he let out a small gasp, his eyes lighting up in a way that made every struggle, every sacrifice, every sleepless night worth it. "Dad, it's the one from the store. The one I wanted." Alex swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his emotions in check. "Merry Christmas, kiddo." Tom threw his arms around him in a tight hug. "This is the best Christmas ever." Alex closed his eyes for a brief second, holding on to that moment, letting it sink in. He didn't know what the next year would bring, what struggles were still ahead. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, his son was happy. And for the first time in a long time, Alex let himself believe that things could get better. That maybe, just maybe, kindness could change everything. The next morning, as snowflakes drifted past the apartment window, Tom sat on the floor, completely absorbed in his new train set. The tiny locomotive moved in perfect circles around the tracks, its wheels clicking softly against the plastic rails. Alex watched from the couch, a warm cup of coffee in his hands, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Somewhere out there, life continued as usual. People rushed through their days, stores filled with last-minute shoppers, the world moving forward without pause. The manager at the toy store was likely dealing with the fallout of his actions, his words now immortalized in videos shared across social media. Keanu Reeves had probably moved on, back to his life, never expecting anything in return for what he had done. But here, in this small apartment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the joy on Tom's face, the sound of his laughter as he made the train go faster, the warmth of knowing that, for once, Alex hadn't let his son down. It was just one moment, one Christmas, one small act of kindness. But sometimes, that was enough to change everything.